Hey there, welcome to Module 7. As with last time, the important thing to note at the beginning of this is actually that time. Our semester is only 8 weeks long, and we really have to be aware of the limits that puts on us. Practically speaking, during the term, I'm always happy to work with students who encounter issues that prevent them from meeting deadlines for their assignments. So for instance, our final research paper is due at the end of this week, and I fully expect that I'll have several late submissions while Module 8 is in progress. And I'm certainly not going to kick up a fuss about that. However, when we reach the end of our course, we also reach the end of my ability to make allowances. The fact is, I am required to have everything assessed and enter final grades just 2 days after the last day for our course. So my message to you is that you should consider these couple of weeks crunch time. If you're behind, or if you get behind this week, remember that I really have to stick to that final Sunday in Module 8 as the absolute inviolable deadline for all work for the course. Besides having our milestone project due, we're also forging ahead with our studies this week. The reading is fairly light, just a short story and a few poems. The workload is also light, with a single discussion for those readings to complete. This should allow a little breathing space for accomplishing the research paper and maybe catching up with anything else that's needed. Now, our subject for the week is the literature we associate with the Harlem Renaissance, so I wanted to spend a moment or two talking about that. The way we're dealing with the Harlem Renaissance in this class is to talk about it kind of as a distinct subject. So I really wanted to emphasize how I see this movement localized by region, made distinct by race, as part of something bigger. I want you to know that this is kind of unusual for a couple of reasons, all of which, well, really come back to race. The impetus for the Harlem Renaissance was a desire to demonstrate equality for African Americans through their ability to achieve in the arts. So when we talk about what people like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, or George Schuyler accomplished, it seems appropriate to tell this as a story of their personal achievement, where these authors are significant primarily by accomplishing that goal. However, that's not the way we usually treat literature. Usually we want to talk about its impact on a broader scale. When we talk about literature with a big L, we're frequently saying that in order to meet that standard, it has to be something that's universal, that reaches everyone. So if we reduce or isolate literature and talking about it within one particular context, that kind of negates that. So I think it's important to know that what I just said about how it's usually taken, that's certainly true in its sense. But I really want to emphasize how the Renaissance offered its own brands of modernism too. So in my notes for this week, I'm going to use the term uplift. This is a concept we relate directly to the early cultural critic and advocate W.E.B. Du Bois. This takes us back to the same early period where we started our readings for the course, right around 1900. Basically, his idea was that African Americans who achieved success, particularly in fields where they had previously been excluded, like being doctors, lawyers, professors, or authors, they should be considered as more than just the people they were. Instead, they were living examples to the world of what African Americans could do. They would be, therefore, inspiration to others who would follow. And these trailblazers would anchor the process by which African Americans as a class would uplift themselves by following their example. Again, writers in the Renaissance like Hughes, Cullen, and Jean Toomer are often thought of in this light. However, to get things started in broadening the context, I want you to keep in mind what I talked about when we first turned to modernism in our poetry overview. And that's the idea that Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot developed about the ultimate purpose for poetry, something characterized by the term high modernism. Remember, this was about using poetry as a kind of, well, lure and prod to encourage readers to understand themselves as part of something larger. And what Eliot and Pound had in mind was for their readers to see themselves as part of what we regularly refer to in the humanities, or at least in the past, as the great Western tradition, something that traces itself back to the highlights of classical antiquity with Homer and Plato. This was done as a kind of centering and validating project to offset the upset of worldview that came with, well, the modern outlook. Now, what I want to suggest is that the project of uplift for the writers in the Harlem Renaissance is not so very far from that thing, from what I just described Eliot and Pound doing. They too, the Harlem Renaissance writers, are speaking about and to a people who need centering and validation, but they're dealing with the problem that the world does not recognize them as part of any great Western tradition. So these writers have to find new ways to achieve the same thing that high modernism does. All right. So I think the parallels are much too close to ignore. So that's how I like to think about it, and that's how I'm presenting it to you. All right. You know what you're doing for this week. You know what our limits are on how how much time we've got left. So I think we've covered what we need to cover. As usual, if you need to talk about anything, have any questions, just let me know, and we'll take care of them. All right. Till next time.